That's totally a pirate ship. Yep, that's it. That's exactly it, Todd. That's a pirate ship. And the first question on the handout is Jeremiah came from a family of pirates. Nailed it. Going to be a great class. Okay, so we are beginning the book of Jeremiah, and I kind of like to give a little subtitle to every book that I teach. And here, my subtitle is Jeremiah, who was appointed for a post-faith world. And we'll talk tonight a little bit about why that is. Jeremiah was a guy who had a pretty rough life. Sometimes he's referred to as the weeping prophet because of the nature of that life that he had. And he saw a lot. So if you take Jeremiah's birth all the way to the end of his life that we know about, it starts about 650, 645 BC. And so he's born during the reign of Manasseh. So if you remember the different kings of the Old Testament, and so now we're talking about the southern kings and the southern nation of Judah, Manasseh was known for being a good or a bad king. Very bad king. Yeah, very bad king. Arguably the worst. He has this whole repentance later on. It's really a beautiful thing, but he caused so much damage during his life. And then 627 BC is right about when Jeremiah is appointed by God to prophesy and preach. So what you read in chapter 1 is right around the time period of 627 BC. So if you do the math on that, he's a young man there, in the neighborhood of his 20s, right? And he's given this job to preach during the reign of Josiah. So born under the reign of Manasseh, really, really bad. Given the job to preach under the reign of Josiah. What kind of king is Josiah? Arguably one of the best that ever was around, right? So you have the contrast between those two. 612 BC, he's going to be alive when the fall of Assyria happens. Assyria is the world empire at the time. They're the ones who swallowed up the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes, and took them off into captivity. He's going to live to see the rise of Babylon, and actually he'll live through a time period where not only does he see the fall of Assyria and the rise of Babylon, but he sees there's a third world empire in there that never quite gets to be the world empire. They get to be the Russia and the U.S.-Russia battle, right? They don't win in the end. But that's Egypt. So he gets to see Assyria fall, Babylon begin to rise, Josiah go into this battle where he ends up dying at the hands of Egypt. And he's going to see Nebuchadnezzar come in. Jeremiah would be there in and around Jerusalem to see the days when Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and all the royal princes and household are taken off into captivity. He lived through that. So I just want you to kind of picture in your mind's eye the world that Jeremiah lived in. Their stories to us, for us to glean information from, they were his life. He actually lived under kings that were so bad that just outside of Jerusalem, they had statues where they were burning babies to death. He lived in a time where that happened. And he could say, yeah, I remember when they did that. And they would pound the drums so that the parents couldn't hear the screams of the children. That, by the way, is accurate historically. But he also lived during the days of Josiah, when Josiah would ride around and point at all of the green trees and high hills with all the idols, and he would point and say, tear that one down, and tear that one down, and tear that one down, and he laid waste all the idolatry. And you can imagine a time like that and the hope that would be involved with that. Josiah is the guy who, if there was nothing else that Josiah is known for, he's the guy who's known for rediscovering what? Anybody remember? The law. Yeah, somebody said it. The law. For rediscovering the law. He went in and said, hey, let's go in there and rebuild the tabernacle, kind of clean out all the junk that my predecessors had put in there. And then while doing that, they find a copy of the law, and when it's read to him, he tears his clothes and he repents, and he says, this is all these awful things that have been happening, they've been happening because we haven't been paying attention to this law. He's this restoration king. And Jeremiah lived during that time period, which would have been thrilling, wouldn't it? You think, this is when it's all coming together. It's finally, we're kind of swinging out of this thing. Manasseh was as dark as it gets, and it's nothing but good times ahead, right? Except it isn't, right? Because after Josiah, then you move forward and you get some more kings, and you eventually end up with Coniah, who is the last king who fits the lineage of David. There's another king after that that's kind of a vassal king who's put in place by Babylon, but Coniah or Jeconiah is eventually taken into exile and replaced by Zedekiah, and Jeremiah saw that too, where the Davidic lineage of kings stopped. And in fact, Jeremiah will be told by God, never again will you see somebody of the line of David sitting on a throne in Jerusalem, when that happened to Coniah. Which is interesting because we do know somebody of the line of David who sits on a throne. Who is it? But where does he sit? Better throne, right hand of God in heaven, right? So he's told there will never be another Davidic king in Jerusalem, but there's one more to come. And so he lived through all of that, and then eventually in 586 BC, having seen the previous waves of Babylonian captivity, he would watch Jerusalem itself fall. And all of the inhabitants deported, except for the most poor, impoverished, destitute of people. And Jeremiah. Because Jeremiah will have the chance to stay. Because Nebuchadnezzar will turn out, will like Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar likes Jeremiah because the entire time Jeremiah is preaching, he's going to be telling the Israelites, don't fight Babylon, give up. That's his message. Give up. Give up and don't fight Babylon because they're going to win. Because you're sinful and you didn't repent, and so this is the consequence. And Nebuchadnezzar hears about this guy who was preaching that you should surrender to Nebuchadnezzar, and he goes, that's my kind of prophet. Right? And so he says, look, you can come back to Babylon with me, and if you come back here, we'll set you up. It'll all be great. It'll be wonderful. You'll have a great life. Or if you want to stay here, I don't know why you would, but you could stay here with all these poor, impoverished people that I'll let stay. Well, Jeremiah says, I want to stay in my homeland. And so, and I'm giving you the short version of it right now, and then we'll go look at a lengthier version over the course of 12 weeks here. But after that, Jeremiah will stay there with the people, and he'll tell them, just follow Babylon's rules, and God will take care of you, and he'll be merciful. And what's the one thing they don't do? Don't follow Babylon's rules. They rebel, and then they decide they're going to flee to Egypt, and they knock Jeremiah over the head and take him with them. Jeremiah ends up being drugged to Egypt, where eventually, to the best of our understanding, that's where he dies. You're going to be hard-pressed to find anybody in your Bible who had a harder life than Jeremiah. It just was a long, grueling journey for him. And God knew it. And so as we look at Jeremiah, I want you to kind of think of it like this. He's going to preach from about 627 BC to about 586 BC. Chapter 1, verse 1 tells us that he comes from a family of priests who are in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. That's just a little bit north of Jerusalem itself. So he would have been right close to Jerusalem to kind of ferry back and forth. We have indications that there were times that he stayed in Anathoth and would preach around Jerusalem, and then it seems like there were times where he was living in Jerusalem itself too. But during the course of his lifetime, he would see 7 Israelite kings, he would see 3 world empires, he would see the moral rebirth of a nation under Josiah, and then he would see the end of that exact same nation, all within his lifetime. I'm reading a book right now by Tom Brokaw called The Greatest Generation. It's one of those books that I've had on my to-do list to read forever. And it's just about people who went through World War II and the World War II generation. And you think about how much has changed for them. Like if you grew up in the early 1900s and you saw how much has changed in the last 75, 80 years, 100 years, it's a very different world, isn't it? A lot happens in one person's lifetime. And for those of us who are not at that stage of having seen that much change, it's hard to have perspective. But you will often find that people who have been through all of that, a generation that went through the Depression, then went through a world war, and then they saw Vietnam, they saw the civil rights movement, all of those things, right? And they also have seen Facebook. They have some perspective on life that's a little bit different than us. That's what I want you to think of Jeremiah as a guy with some perspective. He had some perspective on what life was really about, because he just saw so much of it. And what we'll find is that he was a man that God steeled for a very specific job. If you're outlining the book of Jeremiah, it can be a little bit of a tricky thing to do on a broad scale, and there's more than one way to outline it, so I'll be up front with that. Depending on who's doing the outlining of it, it may look a little different, but if you want to break it down and not have it be, well, here's the 25 different parts of Jeremiah, that's a pretty big outline. If you want a concise one and break it into 5 parts, this would be about how I would do it. The first 25 chapters are messages of warning to a disobedient people. It's a very consistent message for the first 25 chapters. The people need to repent. They are caught up in idolatry. They need to change. A great deal of this happens during the reign of Josiah or immediately after it. What we'll find is that Josiah was a fantastic king. But a good king does not make a good nation. And this is one of the things that we should take to heart as Christians too, is that if you ever get in your mind, if my guy got into the presidency, then all of a sudden it would all get better. They had Josiah. They had King Josiah, the guy who literally would say, we're getting rid of all the idols, and I'm the king, so I have the rules, and I don't take a vote, we're just doing it. And yet as soon as he was gone, guess what happened? All those idols came right back. Because the idols were always in the hearts of the people. Right? There came a point where they had some fear of retribution from the king, some sort of punishment for idolatry, and that held it back in check a little bit. But ultimately, they didn't love Jehovah just because there was a law that said only worship Jehovah. That didn't change things for them. So in these first 25 chapters, what you're primarily seeing is Jeremiah saying, look, you have got to change your hearts. There's only room for one God. And you keep turning to every false god that you can make, and you expect God to be okay with it. And he's not. In the same way, and he'll use some of the similar language that Hosea would use of the marriage relationship, Jeremiah will talk about in the same way that if you were married, you wouldn't be okay if your spouse said, well, I've got my spouse and then I have my other spouses. No? You would have a major problem with that, right? In the same way, God has a major problem. He says there's only room for one God in your life. Then chapter 26 through 36 are messages of judgment and hope. They vacillate back and forth between those two things. Here's the judgment that's coming, but then there's a hope that awaits you. As I mentioned, you have the judgment of Coniah will be the last king to sit on the throne of David in the city of Jerusalem. That's the judgment. What's the hope? There's another king coming, right? The nation's going to be taken off into captivity. You will lose everything. The hope is you will come back someday, 70 years later, you'll come back and you will be a nation that no longer has the issue of idolatry. And I will mention that's going to work, because after the 70 years of Babylonian captivity that Jeremiah predicted, prophesied, and came to fulfillment, after those 70 years, when the Israelites came back, they did not have a problem with idolatry ever again. And here's your proof. When you turn to the New Testament, when did Jesus have to deal with idolatry in the Jews? He didn't have to deal with it at all. Now, he did have to deal with things like the idolatry of the heart, right? Where you would have greed, covetousness, that sort of thing. The apostles will address that. But by the time you get to the New Testament, the Jews have figured out at least one thing. Idols are bad. God doesn't like them. So this 70 years of captivity is going to work. Third part will be messages in times of national crisis. So these are more specific messages during particular moments of national crisis. Unsurprisingly, Israel as a nation will not like what Jeremiah is saying, but then when things get really bad, sometimes they'll turn to him and they'll go, Jeremiah, what does God say we should do? And then Jeremiah will say things like, you should give up. And they'll go, God didn't say that to you. And then, try and kill him. So, part 4, chapter 46 through 51, are messages to foreign nations. So these are particular prophecies that Jeremiah had for nations other than Judah and Israel. And part 5 is a summary of the history that leading up to the captivity. Just a concise breakdown of all of those things together. Does anybody have any comments or questions on that? Okay, I know in an introduction class I normally have a lot of stuff to cover, and I'm a lot more boring on those days, so I apologize. But here, as we look at this, let's start into chapter 1, because chapter 1 really is a good introduction to the relationship between Jeremiah and God. We kind of talked about Jeremiah's relationship with the world that he's going to grow up and then preach in and then have to deal with. And it's one where he sees a lot of change, and he sees some moments of political success in places like King Josiah's reign, but ultimately the hearts of the people are deeply idolatrous, so his message is not popular. But what about his relationship, not with his fellow man, but his relationship with God? Well, I want you to imagine for a second that you're in your 20s, your early 20s, and verse 4 says, the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nation. That's a heavy load to put on a guy's shoulders. I mean, there's a lot of guys in their 20s still playing video games in their parents' basement, right? I mean, that's a lot. But here in his 20s, that's what God says to him. I mean, I don't know, you can only have conjecture here, but the different things that would run through his mind, the weight of it, the uniqueness of it, the fact that God might have made a mistake, and some of that you do see in his response in verse 6, right? Because if you look at verse 6 and verse, just verse 6, and then verse 7 will give you God's response to him. What's Jeremiah's response to being told, I knew you before I formed you in the womb. I knew you, and I appointed and consecrated you a prophet to the nations. What's his response? I'm too young. Alas, Lord God, behold, I do not know how to speak because I'm a youth. Who does that remind you of? Moses, right? It reminds you of Moses, right? I don't know how to speak. Now, here's the thing. Moses did know how to speak. We know that because we can go to some of the New Testament things that talked about how he'd been educated in the ways of the Egyptians and all that kind of stuff. So he had all of this training. He just really didn't want the job, and we know how that went, right? Where there was that back and forth, and he's making excuses. But here is Jeremiah, and Jeremiah goes, I'm just a kid. I'm just a young guy. I'm not the right one for this job. Who are some other very young people that God has used to do things, though, in the history of the Old Testament? Yeah, King. Yeah, King Josiah. Yeah. Who else? Samuel. Yeah. David. Esther. Yeah. John. Joseph. You get a pretty decent list. Solomon. Right? Remember Solomon asking for wisdom. He was concerned, I'm too young to do this job. Yeah. So it's not uncommon for God to take young people and use them. Yeah, Mike? Ehud, yes. Yeah. So you got the judges, you got Ehud, our left-handed fellow. And God has done this on multiple times, right? He's used people that the rest of us would say, wait till they're older. And God says, I'm going to use you now and use you as you get older. Because there's going to come a time where Jeremiah is a prophet to the people and nobody's going to say, oh, that guy's a youth. There's going to be a time through this process where he's going to be a pretty old guy in comparison. But God's going to use him every step of the way. So it's a good reminder to us that we should not discount our youth as a reason to wait to serve. But God will take it so far with him in verse 7 as to say, the Lord said to me, do not say I am a youth. That's God's answer to him, right? Don't say it. I don't want to hear that from you again. His excuse is, Lord, I'm a youth. And he says, I don't want to hear those words out of your mouth ever again. Never again do you get to use that excuse with me. So God is very adamant with Jeremiah. And an interesting thing, funny, Bethany came in and she said, man, the quote from class tonight is verse 17. And I told her, I said, I've underlined it in my Bible too. If you look down in verse 17, look at what it says. This is what God tells them. Gird up your loins and arise and speak to them all which I command you. Do not be dismayed before them, that is the people, or I will dismay you before them. That is not easy language to Jeremiah. And God is not coming along here and saying, Jeremiah, I know you've got a really hard job ahead of you, so I'm just going to really mollycoddle you, and I just want you to feel good about yourself, and I'm just going to stroke your ego and help you to feel really good. He says, I gave you a job, and I don't want any excuses from you. And if you are dismayed in front of the people, in other words, if you won't speak up in front of them, I will give you a reason to be dismayed in front of the people. Terrify. Yeah, okay. So, do not be terrified before them is what yours says. Or I will terrify you before them. Yeah, that gives a pretty strong sense too, doesn't it? So you have this picture that's really a clear one that what God is doing is he says, I have appointed you a preacher to nations. Right? Jeremiah is going to be a prophet to not just one nation, but multiple nations, according to his calling here in verse 5. And we'll see that later on. I mentioned in the timeline, there's whole sections that are devoted to prophecies about other nations too. So he's a guy who's going to go out and preach to people. And he's going to tell them the truth when we all know they're not going to want to hear it. So, how does God prepare him? He doesn't make life easy on him. He tells him right up front, this is going to be hard. And I expect you to do your job because I've appointed you to do the job. And I knew what I was doing when I picked you for it. There are so many different things that you can pull from Jeremiah, but one overriding theme, I think, that I see in Jeremiah a lot is just simply the fact that he was given a job that just seemed like too much for any human being to handle, and yet it wasn't too much to handle. But God knew it. Yep. Yes, absolutely. No, he made him to take a punch, right? He gave him that ability to be that way, to be the guy who doesn't crumple under the pressure, and he could handle people not liking him and saying nasty things to him and not dismay him. So, comfortable with the uncomfortable. And there are some people who are naturally better at that, too. They just have a natural gift for confrontation not bothering them to the same level it does other people. And you're right. I think you have God saying that in verse 5 is that I know the job I'm giving you, and I gave you the character traits you need to do that job. So you got all the right pieces, but what are you going to do with it? And the overall overriding principle I would think we could apply is whatever our lives bring, has God given you the pieces to handle those? And that's what 1 Corinthians 10:13 says, doesn't it? There's no temptation that has come upon you that will... Oh no, my brain froze. 1 Corinthians 10:13, it better be the right verse. No temptation will overtake you, but such is common to man, and there will be a way of escape. And that was not a correct quotation of it, but it's close. Now I got to find it or my brain will fry. No temptation is overtaking you, but such as is common to man, and God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will provide the way of escape also, so that you will be able to endure it. Now my brain's rearranged back to order again. With Jeremiah, he's given this job, and he's told, don't say you're a youth, no excuses are allowed. And he says, because everywhere I send you, you shall go, and all that I command you, you shall speak. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you to deliver you. So you have very strict guidelines. This is your job. You better do it. But it comes with the promise, I will deliver you. Right? I'll pull you out of the fire, no matter what it is. And then in verse 10, he says, I have appointed you this day over the nations. So that goes back to the initial appointment, right? He's appointed as a prophet to the nations. And now he gets more specific. I've appointed you this day over the nations and over the kingdoms to pluck up and to break down, to destroy and to overthrow, to build and to plant. Jeremiah's preaching will be both deconstructive and constructive. He's going to tear things down and build things up. His goal is to get, especially when you talk about the southern kingdom of Judah, get them down to a point where they can actually be rebuilt. You imagine you buy a house and it's just on the edge of being condemned. You have to start tearing things out before you can start fixing it. The first job's always demo, right? You start tearing off old moldy drywall, and you start tearing out pipes that are leaky, and you start tearing out flooring that's a mess, and you just keep tearing it out until you get to a point where you say, okay, everything that is here is good. Now, if it's bad enough, you just light a match, you burn the whole thing down, and you say, we've got a foundation. But at some point, you say, we're at a buildable level, right? That's what Jeremiah's job is. To get them down, to deconstruct them, so that every time something bad happens, he's supposed to be the guy who goes, I'm here to tell you why it's happening. The bad thing that's happening, it's not because of other people. It's not because you're a victim, it's because you're sinful. That's his job, to be the guy who shows up in their moments of terror and distress. When Babylon's knocking on the door and Babylon's going to destroy them, and they're turning and saying, "Why us? Why us?" And he goes, "I can tell you why." As you can imagine, not popular, right? I mean, have you ever made a big mistake and then had that friend who'd like to point out the big mistake you made? Right? Doesn't last as your friend for very long. That's what Jeremiah's job is, to break them down. But then, if any will listen, to then build them up and say, but there's a hope on down the road. God's going to do something great out of this. He's not rejecting you. He's rebuilding you. And so he has a pretty mighty job in that. And we see that even with the foreign nations, God has his hand in play with that. You know, the Bible focuses primarily, especially the Old Testament, primarily on the ongoing events surrounding Israel and how God interacts with them. But that doesn't mean that God isn't interacting with the other nations as well and caring about how things turn out there. Okay. Any comments or questions? When you look in verse 9, he will specifically tell him, "I put my words in your mouth." If you've ever wanted a really clear definition of what a prophet is, this is a great one. A prophet is somebody who God has put his words in their mouth. So when Jeremiah speaks, yes, you hear Jeremiah's vocal cords moving, right? But the message is from God and not from Jeremiah. And so it will carry with it the weight of being with God, God's authority and not Jeremiah's. Now, in the end of chapter 1, there's going to be two visions that he'll have in the end of this chapter. And these two visions are also a good synopsis of what Jeremiah's relationship is in terms of being a prophet to the nations. The first one is of an almond tree. And the word used for almond in this particular vision is a unique word that isn't often used for almond. So here it says, "What do you see, Jeremiah?" And I said, in verse 11, he says, "I see a rod of an almond tree. And the Lord said to me, you've seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it." The word here for almond tree that's used is not the standard word. It's a word that was more uncommon, and it allows for some Hebrew wordplay, and it refers to the idea of it being a watching or wakeful tree. The almond tree blossoms before all the other standard plants. And so it's when you see the almond tree blossoming in that part of the world, it's ahead of the game, so to speak. So it's watchful is where they think that word came from. And so what God says is, look, here's this vision you have of a rod of an almond tree, and he says, you've seen well, I'm watching. I'm watching over my word to perform it. Now, if you're Jeremiah, why is that important for Jeremiah to know that God says, just like the almond tree, it shows up and it hearkens things are coming, spring is on its way. God says, in the same way, I'm watching over my word to perform it. Why would it be so important to Jeremiah to know and have conviction that God is watching over his word to perform it? That's Josiah. That's King Josiah. Oh, where are we at? We're in Jeremiah. So why did I say Josiah? Because I do that sort of thing sometimes. So, yeah. So Jeremiah, what's Jeremiah going to say? What's his general message to people? Yeah, God's going to go to work and you're not going to like it, right? And he's going to call the shot on a bunch of wars too. right? He's going to say, you're going to lose this war and lose this war and lose this war and lose this war, and you're going to be drug off into captivity. Those are some very bold claims to make. Wouldn't it be embarrassing if Jeremiah made those bold claims and then they didn't happen? I mean, we have to think about it from Jeremiah's standpoint. You and I read Jeremiah saying this and we go, good job, Jeremiah. That's exactly how it happened. Because we know that's how it happened. They didn't. He is talking about future events, and he's talking about it without any wiggle room for it to be different. And so God is telling him, I'm watching over my word, which is coming from where? What did he tell him just a few verses before? Where's God's word coming from? Jeremiah's mouth, right? So I'm watching over the words coming from your mouth. I'm watching them, and we're going to make this happen. So it is God's way of confirming to him again that. Then the second one is the one of a boiling pot, and it's facing away from the north. So if you kind of in your mind's eye imagine what it means is it's pouring out from the north. And that's why I have a map up there. The north of Judah is where Assyria, the Euphrates, all of that area where that world empire is from, and eventually, of course, Babylon is from. And what God is saying is, I've got a boiling pot, and it's going to pour from the north down over all of Israel. And he says, verse 14, the Lord said to me, out of the north the evil will break forth on all the inhabitants of the land. For I am calling all the families of the kingdoms of the north, declares the Lord. And they will come, and they will set each one his throne at the entrance of the gates of Jerusalem, and against all its walls round about, and against all the cities of Judah. I will pronounce my judgments on them concerning all their wickedness, whereby they have forsaken me and have offered sacrifices to other gods and worshipped the works of their own hands. So here, he tells them, look, this is what's coming. And he tells them exactly where it's coming from. It's coming from up north. Now, he says this during a time when up north, Babylon isn't the superpower yet. But they will be. They will swallow up Assyria. Egypt will turn into a nothing. And at the time, during the reign of Josiah, it was really more likely that Egypt defeats Assyria than that Babylon shows up to do it. And that's as people were looking at the geopolitical stuff going on, it's like, well, Egypt's the superpower. You should worry about them. And you can think about why. Egypt had pretty much always been a superpower, right? They've been a big dog for a long time. And so for God to tell him, you don't need to worry about Egypt. Don't even think about them. It's going to come from up north, and eventually we'll know that to be Babylon. And he says when they come, they're going to come all around Jerusalem. They're going to surround this city. And you can imagine Jeremiah, as somebody who lived right next to that city, would have gone there regularly, just seeing the walls, these big, massive walls, and saying, this is going to be torn down. This is going to be laid waste. And if you remember, think about some of the history of guys like Nehemiah. Nehemiah, when he returns from captivity, what does Nehemiah come to rebuild? He comes to rebuild the city, rebuild the walls, right? Well, that means somebody tore them all the way down. I mean, it's total rubble by the time you get to guys like Nehemiah and Ezra and Zerubbabel. So what God is telling Jeremiah is this city is going to be totally laid waste. And the reason for it is only one thing. It isn't you made the wrong political maneuver. It isn't the economy. It isn't NATO. He says, I'll pronounce my judgments on them concerning all their wicked. That's what it is. God just very simply says, that's the one problem. If you figured that part out, all the rest would take care of itself. How often is that true in life just as a general truth, right? We just figure out the sin thing and start getting rid of that, all the other stuff starts to take care of it. You know? But so often we are looking for something else to be the silver bullet. Okay. Then, moving on down, verse 18, as we near the end of it, in verse 18 he says, "Behold, I have made you today as a fortified city and as a pillar of iron and as walls of bronze against the whole land, to the kings of Judah, to its princes, to priests, and the people of the land." Okay, so think about this contrast. What did he just say would happen to the walls of Jerusalem? They're going to get laid down, right? So what have I made you, Jeremiah? Your bronze walls. You're the wall. And we use that sort of phrasing ourselves. We talk about things. I've done that even with my kids before. I've said, look, I'm your dad. I'm supposed to protect you. It's my job to be the wall. That's a phrase that we use even in just kind of common English to talk about the idea of standing in the gap. That one comes from Ezekiel, that idea of standing in the gap. But he's telling them, he says, you're the only wall they've got. They think that the walls that will protect them are the walls of this city. The only thing that would actually protect them would be if they got within the walls of your preaching. If they would listen to Jeremiah, they'd be safe. But guess what they're not going to do? Not going to listen to Jeremiah. That's why he's the weeping prophet. So he's going to spend his whole life being the guy. In fact, they'll give him the nickname of Old Woe Is Me, right? Whoa, whoa. Whenever he starts coming up, whoa, whoa, here he comes, whoa. And it's because his message is always just like sadness and death and dying. And, they just want to have their parties and have their fun, right? And so here he tells them, look, I'm going to make you the fortified city that Jerusalem isn't. I'm going to make you the wall that they could actually be protected by. So if they'll listen to you, they'll be safe. But, down in verse 19, they will fight against you, but they will not overcome you, for I am with you to deliver you, declares the Lord. So if you remember, in verse 8, he's now said that 2 times, verse 8 and verse 19, I'm with you to deliver you. So God's not one on saying things twice just for fun. If he says it twice, there's normally a reason for it. The likely reason for this would be what? Why would he tell Jeremiah twice, I am with you to deliver you? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's that emphasis of you need to know and understand I'm going to be with you through this whole thing. And I love that God's willing to repeat himself, because it's not like God needs it repeated for him. He says it twice because we need it, So it shows you that grace and compassion of him to understand when he gives people a job. So that's introductory material. Next week, the reading. At the beginning here, we'll go a little slower, but then as we go through the book, it's going to pick up pace, and then we're going to cover large swaths very quickly. So next week is just chapter 2. So if you're mapping in your mind a 12-week class on Jeremiah, I spent one chapter 1 this week, chapter 2 next week. We'll do all of the rest in week 3 when Corey teaches. So thank you all very much. Elders, does anybody have